I can't tell you how much of a privilege it is being here for all kinds of reasons. This is a historic room. To see this group of students is truly empowering and exhilarating. And particularly to see this group of students continue a tradition of intellectual dialogue, inquiry, intellectualism, when frankly your elders like us have badly let you down in the institutions we are creating, is truly remarkable. So first of all, you all deserve a round of applause for yourselves. I think this itself is an extraordinary event. So when I was asked to participate in this, I immediately said yes, but I wanted something different, and maybe we'll accomplish some of it today. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to improvise a lot, given that this is an informal event, apparently officially as well, which is, I wanted to hear more from you. What kinds of questions animate you? What are the intellectual anxieties and puzzles that are driving your conversations? And I wanted to do that for a bunch of reasons. Some just to educate myself. I mean, I think we all reach a certain age where we continue to live off the intellectual capital we acquired 20, 30 years ago, and without realizing it, don't recognize just how obsolete it has become. So what we can learn from you, I think at this point, is actually much more important than what we have to offer. And I mean that sincerely. So we hope we have a chance for that conversation and dialogue, and no rules for that. Any questions on your mind? But the second, more theoretical reason, and that's the kind of the preface why I've chosen this topic, right, is, as the introduction very eloquently said, this is a time of extraordinary political flux all across the world. In fact, given the stakes of what is happening all across the world, and the profound nature and forms in which politics is changing, so many of our conventional conversations seem so parochial and backward-looking. We are caught in a time warp, right? We are litigating 1947 all over again, not to mention litigating 1526, right? We are fighting over, in a sense, the legacy of Ambedkar, Nehru, Gandhi, Savarkar. And of course, we should understand that legacy. But one of the things about them, they all did their own thinking. Our future cannot be hostage to getting their textual interpretation right. In fact, they would be aghast, right? There are so many side alleys we are pursuing. And just to provoke you, let me just throw out one in a sentence, not defend it now, but we can take it up in discussion. So, for example, one of the things I am extremely theoretically impatient about these days is the question of should there be an Indian political theory, or what is Indian political thought, right? Now, at one level, obviously that question makes sense if all you mean by it is quotidian things, which is we must read a diverse range of sources, many of them very important to the shaping of intellectual life in India. We need to understand what kinds of normative concerns citizens are raising in the course of making demands on each other in the state, right? There's a very plain sense in which that's obviously true, right? We have to, in a sense, try and understand India and the context from which it is coming. But, and I will explain a theoretical reason at the end of this talk, at a more general level, that question is a complete misdirection from where political theory ought to be going and where political theory in fact is going. Because the simple task for political theory, for India, for all of you who are engaged in this deliberative dialogue, right, theoretically informed, is simply, what are the terms on which we want to live with each other, right, that give everybody a sense of stake, dignity, agency in the society, right? It's a simple question. Now, to answer that question, you can draw on all kinds of sources. But it's always been my contention that the minute you put an identity prefix before a theoretical argument, Chinese theory, Indian theory, you have stopped thinking. I firmly believe with Andre Bite, you can have identity or reason, but if you cannot have identity qualifying reason. So let's just talk directly about what kind of society we want to build, rather than agonize and worry about, is this Indian, whatever that means, right? But I'll give you a theoretical reason for that as we go on. So why did I choose this theme, reflections on global political thought, right? What's the aim? And what I'll do is sketch out some introductory remarks to try and put the Indian debate about Indian political theory in a kind of global context, right? And hopefully that'll give you a sense for why I said what I said up front. Suppose you were writing a history of 20th century political thought, right? Let's just take 20th century as a marker. You can begin in the late 19th century globally. There are different ways of writing it and dividing up the subject, right? Some would write it as a history of economic systems, capitalism versus socialism versus communism, right? That was the big politically animating theme of the 20th century. And that also provided a kind of theoretical template, right? You could write it in terms of national traditions, Indian political thought, Chinese political thought. But if you write it in terms of national traditions, the term Indian or Chinese ends up just being a geographical marker. What is Indian political thought? All that was said and thought in India, which includes Western political thought and socialist political thought and communist political thought, right? Right? So you could organize it that way, right? You could organize it around another animating theme, which is the distinction between democracy and authoritarianism. Something that animates our politics right now. A lot of our angst about political theory is we kind of thought we had a liberal democracy, although many people were always very skeptical of liberal democracy, and I have to say this university was never a big fan of liberal democracy intellectually. They've discovered it late. Every single argument the right uses against Jawaharlal Nehru was made here by the left. But nevertheless, right, we are clinging on to liberal democracy as some kind of last institutional edifice of defense against something, against communalism, against authoritarianism, right? And in that context, the contest between liberalism and its alternatives, liberal democracy and its alternatives, has actually become up front and center, right? So you could divide the world up that way, right? How do we defend liberal democracy and so forth? And it's kind of ironic, right, that, in the introduction, you mentioned basic structure. In a strange way, if you think about the basic structure doctrine, I mean, I've said this before, which is, it's actually a perfect illustration of the end of history argument. Because what it basically says is, there is an inviolable basic normative structure. We cannot think beyond or transcend the horizons of that structure. When we ask what is the fight for liberal democracy in India right now, right? In part, it is the fight to preserve just that basic structure, right? So, in that sense, political theory has kind of been arrested by the basic structure, right? And maybe for good political reasons, right? So what I thought I'd do is maybe propose a slightly different way of organizing political theory globally, and which may then give the Indian kind of question a slightly different theoretical spin. So the way I would organize it, and this is just one way of doing it, I'm not saying all those other ways are not legitimate or they don't generate profound theoretical insights. But when we talk about the crisis of liberal democracy at this moment, right? And crisis simply meaning people losing faith in liberal democracy. The system of governance that is spawning is, in a sense, being buried under the weight of its own contradictions, right? And it having to resort to more and more coercion or abridgment of freedom to maintain itself, right? It's true of all liberal democracies. But one of the remarkable things about this moment in global history, and I'll dwell on this moment and then move back to political theory, is that almost all forms of political legitimation are experiencing a crisis of their own. And so what do I mean by forms of political legitimation? What do we mean by crisis? So legitimacy is a theoretical term. But let's speak very colloquially. It always kind of concentrates the mind to speak very colloquially first. Every society has a kind of grammar of legitimation, right? Things that, broadly speaking, large sections of the society take for granted as appropriate normative claims to be making on each other, and the enforcement of which, therefore, doesn't require as much coercion. Now, it doesn't mean that everything that people think is legitimate is actually normatively justified. Legitimacy is a political concept. It's not a normative concept, right? Right? And legitimacy breaks down, or you can see signs of legitimacy breaking down, when people's allegiance in that basic legitimacy framework begins to decline. What that often means is those regimes will, as I said, have to resort to more coercion. They'll have to coerce people into unfreedom to get to do things, right? If a framework is legitimate, in part, one of its tests is that people actually freely, in a sense, enact its requirements, right? So I'm speaking very colloquially here. Now, one of the things, if you look at different parts of the world, right, from the 18th century onwards, but particularly the late 19th century, in different parts of the world, a certain basic legitimation framework became a kind of meta-narrative that got entrenched in politics. So I'll just give you one example. So if you think of American politics, right? American politics, broadly speaking, still works within the horizon of the 1776 settlement, right? Everybody has to make reference to that constitution. All political theories, including distinctions between left and right, are distinctions within the horizon of that constitution and interpreted within it, right? Okay? That's one example, right? The French are still debating the French Revolution, 17, right? So a basic legitimation framework has, broadly speaking, three attributes to it, which is it provides a normative frame, gives some normative content. It will be contested, revised, but the revision and contestation is self-referential. It's within just the terms of that constitution, right? Second, and more importantly for politics, it spawns a regime type. It's not just a theory. It's an actual political regime practice of governance, right? So the American Constitution is not just a theory. It's a structured regime with allocation of powers, allocation of authority, determining opportunities for people, right? Sorry. Right? Now, if you look at the late 19th century and from the early 20th century onwards, and if you want to think of legitimating frameworks in the world, one way of thinking about it is in terms of the following frameworks, and I'll just very be brief about it, which is, what were the frameworks on offer that perform the kind of meta-narrative and function that, let's say, 1776 has performed for the United States, right? One framework, let's say, originates in India, and this is Indian political theory's biggest export, in the shape of Maududi, who I think happens to be one of the 20th century's most influential political thinkers, if you just went by political influence, right? That is, in a sense, structured around the question, right, of what would a kind of modern form of Islamic constitutionalism look like, right? That's the debate in Pakistan, that's the debate in Egypt, that's the debate, in some senses, Saudi Arabia. There are different variations of Iran, right? This meta-narrative made certain claims, right? Some normative claims, some historical claims. So, just to give kind of examples, it's one of the most elaborately worked out political theories. I mean, the kind of the jurisprudential and philosophical sophistication of it is staggering in some way, right? But it's a political theory that begins with acknowledging the sovereignty of God, in part to say that if we don't acknowledge God as sovereign, what it will be replaced by is the domination of one person over another. Right? It has a kind of theological account in the sense of equality, right? Then things get more interesting. It has a reading of the last 10th centuries of history. I think Iqbal's, in a sense, exemplifies it better, which basically argues that contrary to what liberalism thinks, right? So the liberal view of the religion, of the connection between religion and politics has always been that one of the reasons you separate church and state is because it also allows religion to flourish in all its authenticity, right? This was the 19th century reading of why in Europe there is a revolt against religion, because if religion and state are conflated, as they were in Catholic France, when people get upset at the state, they'll also revolt against the religion, right? So it's not just that it's in the interest of individual autonomy that you separate church and state, right? There's also actually, in a sense, a kind of a logic whereby religion begins to understand why it's important for this bifurcation to happen. But the diagnosis in this set of political theories, beginning with Maududi, is that that is actually a mistake. It's a mistake for two very different theoretical reasons. One, it's a mistake because the liberal claim that political secularization will not lead to whole-scale social secularization is simply false, right? That was Iqbal's critique of this separation of church and state. The second reason, theological reason, philosophical reason, actually normative reason, you can think about this reason even independently of theological commitments, is a persistent strain in 20th century political thought that opposes what you might call the liberal fragmentation of experience. Right? So what do we mean by that? We often talk about liberalism in terms of individual rights and so on and so forth. Most of you have read Marx's Jewish Question. Marx is the first early critique of the liberal kind of critique of fragmentation. The idea behind fragmentation, best personified in Max Weber, is it is going to be our condition in the modern world that we simultaneously live out different modes of experience with their own individual logic, right? So the logic of the state is equality, mutual recognition, reciprocity. The logic of the market is a reciprocity of a different kind, right? Exchange, commodification, right? The logic of arts and aesthetics and the sphere of eroticism is, in a sense, subjectivism, right? Even modern art is about subjectivity. It's not about creating common public meanings. The state requires monopoly over violence and uses violence as an instrument. It's inherent in the nature of the state, which, of course, will also be in tension with an ethical mode of existence, where you actually think that the point of existence is to make everything ethically consistent, right? Now, liberalism's strongest claim was that under conditions of modernity, you cannot overcome this fragmentation of experience. So when Marx said there's a contradiction between the citizen and the producer, liberals' answer is that's exactly right. That's exactly how, in fact, Marx is the best, in a sense, I think, articulation of what that position is, right? But the argument, the core liberal argument was that the idea that experience is a unified whole, right, where we experience the world as a single whole without contradictions, that impulse is sociologically not possible. The only way you can produce this is by simplifying society and abridging freedoms, right? And it's actually humanly, normatively not desirable. We are destined to be fragmented creatures. And in a sense, liberalism is about managing the nature of this fragmentation in a way that can do justice to his ideas. But But one of the most remarkable dividing lines in political thought is basically people who accept this fragmentation as a starting point and those who don't. Right? There have been critics on the left from this fragmentation. Right? So on this liberal view, these contradictions and hypocrisies, they are constitutive of a rich moral life. They are not objections against it. Right? In some forms, Marxism is one kind of critique, that you could imagine a historical process where all these contradictions are overcome, right? In a sense, the self is united with society in a seamless whole without contradiction, right? But the other challenge to it, and I think the most profound one was articulated in modern Islamic thought, was actually from the point of view of religious experience. You know, if you're interested in concepts like khudi, for example, right? How can you actually make sense of a concept like that if your social and ethical experience is destined to be fragmented in this way? Right? So this is serious political theory. I mean, it's not, right? So you had the sovereignty of God. You had a critique of the separation of church and state. You have a critique of the fragmentation of experience. And then the question, what political form can do justice to these normative claims, right? And very briefly, that's basically what kind of Maududi put on the table, a form of kind of theodemocracy, right? Where one of the things they all recognize that in the modern world, it is important that whatever political system you have, claim legitimacy in the name of the people. People's sense of agency and ownership of that system, right? So it was very anti-clerical at one level, right? It's very kind of anti-orthodox at one level, right? But if you take these assumptions and then add a further assumption that the system of law, Sharia in this case, again being reductive, should be regarded as a kind of a scheme of emancipation. It can be reformed, it's a scheme of, but reference to that's a framework within which you operate. What kind of political system would be appropriate for that, right? And you got a standard set of combinations, which is at one level democracy, some form of representative government, but guided by some form of clerical establishment, right? Acknowledging the fact that Islam as an identity would have to be benchmarked in that constitution, because that's what makes it an Islamic, right? And forms of policies that strive to restore the unity of experience. I mean very simplistic, but you get the broad point, right? It's remarkable how influential and consequential this framework was, right? I mean, in a sense, different ways from Pakistan to Iran, struggling with this combination of elements. But it's also fair to say that this project, and there was a political edge added onto this project if you actually add this idea that Islam as a kind of political idea is under danger in the modern world, right? This project is basically now sinking under the weight of its own contradictions all across the world, right? Right? The entire kind of crisis from sort of Iran to Egypt. Again, I mean simplifying, but there's a kind of normative vacuum there, right? It doesn't mean those regimes are going to collapse, but it does mean that this set of assumptions cannot provide a kind of legitimizing framework that has widespread consent. So that's one set of projects in a sense. There's African political thought. I won't dwell on it, but the basic fault line in African political thought was, how do you create a political form in Africa that does not reproduce the color line or racism as a hierarchical principle in domestic and world politics, right? That's why so much emphasis on kind of, African Union, or the whole kind of utopian hopes of the 1960s and 70s, right? That project, in a sense, is floundering. Okay. So what were the other two projects left? Now, the other two projects, one was liberal democracy, and we've talked a lot about the crisis of liberal democracy, recently, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But the other is, of course, the party state as a political form, right? Let's not forget the party state, China, almost 100 years as a political form. It's an enduring political form. I mean, democracy is not 100 years old in most places, right? It has all the characteristics that I identified of a basic legitimation framework, right? It has a political theory of why you need a party state, derives from Lenin, but there is a Chinese, in a sense, modification to it, right? Right? It becomes an enduring political form, and almost all the debates in contemporary Chinese political thought are conducted within the framework of the future of the party state. The distinction between left and right, just like in our case, that's a distinction within the basic structure. Right? In China, that's a distinction, in a sense, within the form of the party state. Right? Now, what I want to submit to you, and this is maybe the kind of the theoretical punchline, is I actually want to connect the crisis of the party state and the crisis of liberal democracy, right, together. That both aspects of the same crisis. Okay, why? Okay, this is the, but these are in a sense not separate crises, right? So one of the most astonishing, there's one quote I wanted to read out. The papers got mixed up. I'll just take 1 second. So one of the most astonishing features of modern political theory, right, beginning with the French Revolution, and it works through the French Revolution, it works through Indian national movement, decolonization, is the sense that the core idea in modern political theory is, you might say, freedom. We are the ground of our own being. We are not, in a sense, wedded to some higher power. As I said, there's religious political theories that might deny that. But the alternative to that, right, in that radical secular notion is, we are the ground of our own being. And the only form of politics that's appropriate to the modern world is a self-grounded politics, as it were. Politics generating its own normativity out of the activity of politics, right? There's no pre-given God. There's no pre-given normative consensus outside the activity of citizens engaging with each other and producing one, right? Right? Because where would that come from, right? You could have an ethical theory, a perfectionist theory of the good, but most people won't agree on it. Who gave you the authority to decide good to somebody else? All the standard problems, right? So modern politics is not anchored, cannot be anchored in the recovery of a higher perfectionist self or even a historical telos. It's essentially a movement of the self trying to liberate itself to achieve its own purposes, right? And Marxism, in its purest form, right, was the most radical articulation of this idea. I mean, what is, in a sense, the Marxist utopia, right? It basically says, in a sense, it's the condition of perfect freedom, right? Freedom is the central concept for Marx. Freedom to make yourself, your relationships with others are completely freely chosen, right? And spontaneous. So, I mean, you know all that very well, right? If the terms of our social cooperation are freely chosen, then all of us would be realizing our individual freedom in the terms of that social cooperation, right? Yeah? Now, after World War II, and if you want to trace the end of history thesis, I would actually I think World War II is actually a better point than 1989, right? Because with World War II, in a sense, two things began to happen. One, World War II is the end of sort of utopian thinking, right? It's kind of, utopian thinking drops out of political theory. Cold War liberalism is the liberalism of fear. It's trying to protect a basic sliver of liberal democracy amidst hostile forces, right? Communism, right, is no longer a utopia, to put it mildly. In fact, in many cases, it's a picture of a dystopia, right? But interestingly, and this is the point I want to make about the Chinese political system, that This idea that political theory is self-grounding, right, is an idea that also actually animates modern Chinese political thought, right? So, Mao once said, and I used to think it was a flippant remark, that his political theory was a combination of American pragmatism and Russian revolutionary fervor. It's an extraordinary thing to say. But Mao was packing something deep and important about modern politics in it. So what makes Chinese political thought anti-utopian post-war? First of all, there is no telos. There is no end state to this, right? It's much more Machiavellian, right? We have one problem, one contradiction, we fix it. Another contradiction arises, we fix it. Another contradiction arises, we fix it, right? There is no, in a sense, historical telos or utopian emancipation from this problem of, in a sense, perpetually overcoming contradictions. Mao goes even more radical. I mean, this is the part we forget about Mao. The only country in whose political thought there isn't much class analysis in the last 40 years is actually China. Because Mao realizes after 1947 that classes are not a natural subject. They are also constituted through the activity of the party and the politics, right? Right? And there's a kind of nihilism about power in Maoism. I mean, it's kind of absolutely brutal and ruthless in that respect, right? But what it does form is this very successful instrument that if politics is self-grounding, how do we organize power, right? Essentially, there are two institutions that have been the central in our imagination to organizing that power. One is the nation state, right? Why nationalism is so? It's the form in which we express our collective agency in the modern world, right? Why do we want to decolonize? Why should we have national self-determination? Unless the people possess a political form of their own, they cannot acquire a sense of collective agency to take charge of their own destiny, right? At its core, the nation state derives its energy from that democratic impulse, right? Not all forms of nationalism, but the nation state is a political form. But the other big organization of the 20th century was the political party. And the political party is an extraordinarily novel form of political organization. It's both universal and particular. A modern political party speaks in terms of goals, values, principles, right? And yet, it's a particular organization, right? It's voluntary, right? Purely ethnic parties and religious parties are, in a sense, oxymoronic to the idea of a political party, right? Because the aim of a political party is to organize power in a way in which you can exercise agency to do things. This is true of the Chinese Communist Party, but it is also true of parties in a liberal democracy. What is the aim of a party in a liberal democracy? The aim of a party in a liberal democracy, if you're a serious party, is to craft a majority coalition that allows you to give expression to the will of the people as you best understand it. If you're not in the business of crafting that majority coalition, you're not a serious party in a political democracy, right? So the political party is extraordinarily central, not just as a political organization in the modern world, but it is the conduit through which we express our sense of collective agency. How do we do things together in a democracy, right? We do things together by coming together in associations. And of course, the most important association is the one that actually gives you the power to do things, right? I mean, the political party is seriously, it's the orphan child of political theory. But it's the most central institution of 20th century politics, right? So both the Chinese state, for all its different content, right? The Chinese party state has a different character. The purpose of a party is that it's led by a vanguard that is authorized to diagnose what are the principal contradictions in society. The party is the bridge between the present and the future, right? Right? In liberal democracies, parties are supposed to flourish under competitive structures, right? That's the difference in a sense between a one-party state and a liberal democracy. And if a parties function under a competitive structure, so the argument went, that would be the principal mechanism by which liberal democracy is maintained and preserved, right? Okay. When we think of the backsliding of democracy these days, we normally think of one dimension of it, which is the erasure of individual rights, the erosion of checks and balances, right? Right? The abridgment of free speech, so on and so forth. But modern liberal democracies have two different architectures, and they are actually colliding with each other at the moment. And that's, in a sense, one aspect of the crisis of liberal democracy. So one architecture is the constitutional architecture that we write about in Handbook to the Indian Constitution, separation of powers, executive, legislature, judiciary, all the nice constitutional arrangements, right, that we want to defend. The other mechanism is competitive party elections, right? That the way you preserve accountability in democracy and make that compatible with the people periodically exercising their agency, right, is through a competitive political party system, right? And in an ideal world, these parties would balance each other. They would place emphasis on slightly different principles. One would be a party of order, one would be a party of liberty, one would be a party of slight privilege, one would be a party of equality. They actually, in their contestation, produce a balance. Right? So the balanced constitution is not just a formal structure. It is reflected in the structure of power in society through political parties. Now, and this is the kind of closing thought, the challenge for our political theory is both in liberal democracies and in the Chinese communist state, right? This central institution is in deep crisis, right? So in liberal democracy, the central contradiction we are facing, apart from lots of other things, inequality and stuff which we've talked about, is between two different logics. So on the one hand is the logic of constitutionalism. On the other hand is the logic of competitive party politics. And competitive party politics by definition works on partisanship, right? I have to get my party to win. If you're serious about democratic politics, that's how you have to think, right? Otherwise, you're not serious about democratic politics, honestly, right? You're not serious about the agency dimension of democratic politics. How do I represent more and more people to exercise collective power so that we can change things, right? Now, what we are finding in countries like India, countries like the United States, is these two logics of constitutionalism and partisanship are completely colliding head-on. Because the assumption was that actually partisanship of party politics remains within certain bounds, right? I mean, we used to kind of joke, we used to hate the fact that politicians actually don't disagree with each other really. They're all members of the same club, they look after each other, right? How nostalgic we are for those days, right? Those days, they were awful in some ways, but they also made institutions run better, right? But if you are in a political structure where it's political partisanship all the way down, right? Which is to say the imperative of crafting a coalition that your side wins, right? Inflects almost every position and every argument you take, right? Including sometimes theoretical arguments, academic arguments, right? Partisanship of that kind has a way of corroding out and working against the cross purposes, right? It works at cross purposes with this constitutional schema, right? We think liberal democracy is crisis, it is in crisis, but those who are winning power don't think so, right? They represent themselves as agents of democracy, right? And justifiably so. because they say we are representing democracy in its agency dimension. All of you nice basic structure type people, constitutional, separation of powers, all you folks, all you have done is created a complicated structure of governance that thwarts the actual agency of the people, which is reflected in the majority coalition that you build. Right? That's what Trump says, right? Why do we need to toss aside all these university, all this? Because these are contrivances to thwart the agency aspect of democracy. Right? So that's in a sense the internal crisis of liberalism. The Chinese Communist Party state, right, actually has an internal crisis of its own. It's relying more and more on repression, even compared to the last 10, 15 years. And the question is, which way will the Chinese Communist Party state turn, right? What is its, right? There are three proposals on offer. One is that China has to become a liberal democracy. You need a competitive party system at some point, right, to overcome the internal deficiencies of the current party state. The second, which some political theorists argue, is that the party will have to rediscover its mass mobilization capacities. So the way you connect with the people is in some senses to reconstruct the party from a bureaucratic governing organization back to a mass mobilization organization. And frankly, in China, that's a nightmare because that usually means cultural revolution, right? The third, right, which is increasingly why there's a turn in Chinese political thought to Confucian political theory, is not only do you position the party as a carrier of nationalism. So look, we all want to be collective agents in the global system, right? What is going to be the instrument of that? The nation state, right? Everything else then flows from that project. And the nation state then, in a sense, has to be articulated, right, in terms of particular tradition and culture, right? So the invocation, this odd invocation of Confucianism, right? We actually have a parallel process going on, which is one of the things the BJP and Mr. Modi, I think, can claim justly, right? And if you're serious about politics, you have to grant him this claim. He claims to express the political agency of the people. I want to do things in name of the people, being authorized by them, because I've crafted these majorities, right? Right? But if you're thinking of the collective agency of the people in a global system, again, what's going to be the instrument? That nation state, right? The foundations of that nation state, if it is going to act as a form of collective agent, will have to, guess what, invoke different kinds of unities than we do. We liberals were all these proceduralists. Let freedom reign. Whatever comes out of it will be India's national identity. And I firmly believe that, right? But you can see that if your diagnosis is that this structure of freedom is exactly what disables collective political agency, right? So it's not an accident that both India and China are the two states that think of themselves as civilization states all of a sudden, right? It's not an accident that the BJP envies the Chinese party state, because the party state says the party is going to be the sole instrument by which the collective agency of the people can be harmoniously exercised, right? So all social conflicts are conflicts within the party. And by the way, they would say, look, that's what the Congress party also used to do, but it's, right? So if you think about it this way, right, one of the challenges was look around the world and say the internal contradictions and legitimation crises of all the major political forms and meta-narratives of the 20th century, right, are hitting different parts of the world simultaneously, right? It's not that authoritarianism is triumphing over liberal democracy, right? As I said, the party state is experiencing a crisis of its own, we can talk about, right? And so we are at this point where, there's this kind of exhaustion of all of these meta-narratives. I mean, they're going to survive because of a certain kind of historical momentum, right? They're deeply entrenched in institutional forms. It's hard to change. But they're increasingly being hollowed out to caricatures and shells of themselves, right? The Chinese Communist Party does not have an emancipatory bone left in it, right? Never, probably hasn't had since the 1950s, right? Right. But increasingly, liberal democracy is not seen as fulfilling that collective agency dimension, which is the core aspiration of modern politics, right? Not just that we are individually free, but that we collectively do things we could not, right? So here we are, and love to hear from you. I mean, I just kind of, the Indian crisis is not peculiar. And it's not going to be analyzed only in terms of Indian materials or Indian stuff, right? Where do we go from here, right? Like the Chinese system, we can have three responses, right? There's the response that basically says status quo, only slightly better, right? That's the basic structure. Let's preserve it somehow solution, right? There's the authoritarian solution, right? That you might as well kind of play out the logic of this breakdown. Or the third is a kind of ethicized moral solution, that somehow the antidote to modern politics will be found in something called theory, an ethical standpoint, Indian culture, something, right? That's the context in which there's an invocation of Indian political theory by both the right and the left, right? To me, that's a sign that we are completely disabled in our political agency. Because we are looking to culture to solve a problem, right? That is actually a problem about our collective future. So I'll stop there. Just any questions, any answers?